Look, let's start with a game actually that will kick off on Sunday, and we wanted to do kind of recap Eintracht Frankfurt's defeat to Tottenham yesterday, the last German team exiting from a European competition. Um, I didn't realize this is actually the case, but this is only the fourth time in history that there will be no Bundesliga team in the semifinals of a European competition. The last three times this happened was in 2020, 21, 2016, 17, 2004, 2005. So, relatively recent. The last, I, I don't know. I guess it's because Bayern Munich usually make a semifinal of a European competition, so maybe it glosses over a few things. I thought about this a little bit. I think in general, we were so spoiled last year, Stefan, with all the teams that went so deep in the competition. And then, of course, Frankfurt had so many runs deep into the competition as well. They really are reliable, a very reliable team in European competitions for Germany. We had a few duds in Europe as well. Heidenheim, I think, were completely out of depth. Hoffenheim, so much chaos at that club. They didn't go very far. I think Stuttgart gave it a good shot, but it just wasn't meant to be. Leipzig is probably the biggest disappointment. They should have really gotten out of the Champions League stage. I think that is the one where you say like that is probably just a really big disappointment. And Dortmund and Bayern, I think, gave it a really good shot in their respective quarterfinals. Bayern maybe should have gone through. Dortmund, I gave it a really good run. And of course, Frankfurt, I watched that game yesterday, and I actually think they were the better of the two teams, but I think they could have also still be playing today and not score a goal.
Yeah, it was a really difficult night for Frankfurt. I kind of said it full time. Obviously, we watched the game. He's chatted with our subscribers in the live chat about it on Substack, and it was actually a game where I thought Tottenham, for perhaps the first time this season, actually looked quite dogged. They looked quite hard to break down. They looked like they're willing to put a fight in. They're usually this team that kind of help teams score goals against them because they've just been so wide open. But Frankfurt just didn't really seem to have the means or the will to kind of break them down. I think obviously a large part of that is due to the fact that Mario Götze went off injured in the first half. And it was just a match that for some bizarre reason the ball just kept falling to Christensen in the box. He could have probably scored 3 or 4 goals last night, but obviously he's not the player you want that ball falling to. But I think that's largely due to the fact that most of Frankfurt's attacking players were marked out of the game. Hugo Ekitike gave it a good shot, but he was really up against 2 or 3 players every time he got on the ball. I do just kind of wonder, or I did wonder at full time, I thought, Frankfurt didn't look really distraught about being knocked out of the competition, to be honest with you. Obviously, they're gutted to be out of a competition, but it's a competition they've won, and they've seemingly or presumably got bigger fish to fry in the Bundesliga. And I did kind of wonder watching the game. I was like, did these players kind of think maybe getting knocked out of the competition at this stage and actually finishing in the top four would be far more interesting? It's far more intriguing for us as a team. Especially for a team who's already won the Europa League. A lot of these players have already won it. And, obviously getting to a final and winning a European trophy is an amazing experience for any player. And I'm not at all suggesting that they just threw the game or anything like that. But I just wonder if this club kind of has had its heart set on getting into the top four. And that's what everything's aimed towards. You obviously interviewed not the CEO, chief executive?
Director of football.
Director of football, sorry. And he made it's a great interview on the Transmark website, which you go find. And he makes it pretty clear, it's like, everything's kind of geared towards that top four finish. We want to try and make sure we stick that landing in the last kind of weeks of the season. And, their form has been very bumpy. Over the course of 2025 so far, they are fourth in the table in terms of points won since the turn of the year, but they're only 3 points above Leipzig, Mainz, and Freiburg, who all have 21 points each. So it's a very thin margin that they're on in the Bundesliga, and I just do wonder if a lot of those players last night maybe thought, it'd be great if we could win another Europa League or get to the final, but it's not our biggest concern. But as you said, in terms of the actual wider implications for European football, I do kind of have an interesting theory. So, obviously, last season, Dortmund got to the final or got into the Champions League because they got to the final of the Champions League, which knocks
Mm.
everyone down a rung or two, which means Hoffenheim get into the Europa League and it means Heidenheim get into the Conference League, if I'm not mistaken. I think that was the case. My
The
memory's not
German
what it
Cup
used.
also played a role in that too.
Of
And
course, yeah.
you're right, yeah, but you're right. Because of the German Cup and Leverkusen winning it, that also bumps it all down. I think eighth still qualified, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Heidenheim in eighth qualified. So I wonder if, if Dortmund hadn't got to the Champions League final, or was the fifth place because of the coefficients in the
No,
Bundesliga?
so no, so you're right because Dortmund
Okay.
goes to the final.
Uh-huh.
The Bundesliga finishes second in the 5-year coefficient standings for that year, not overall over 5 years, and that means the fifth place became a Champions League spot, which meant that six became direct Europa League, and then seventh
Hoffenheim, yeah, Europa League as well.
became also Europa League spot because the DFB Pokal one was won by Leverkusen, which meant the Europa League spot went back to the Bundesliga, and that means eighth became the Conference League spot. So you are right.
Yeah. So had that not all happened, this season we would have had Dortmund, Frankfurt in Europa League, and then
Yeah.
Hoffenheim in the Conference League. And I just kind of wonder if, Hoffenheim in the Conference League would have probably been a far better fit for them.
Yeah.
And, Dortmund probably would have done it a lot better in the. I mean, I know they did very well in the Champions League by all means, so it's a bit of a flawed system, I guess. But, you can imagine if this Dortmund team were in Europa League, they probably would maybe still be in the competition. So there's that kind of little wrinkle of consequences which kind of played through. But as you said, we've also had at least 3, 4 teams who qualified for Europe this season just completely implode
Mm.
compared to their form this season. Stuttgart, the most obvious ones, who have gone from being the second best team in Germany according to the league table to a distinctly mid-table club. That's not a slight on Stuttgart. It's just reality of the circumstances that have hit them this season. Leipzig equally have imploded and sacked their head coach. Dortmund imploded, sacked their head coach. Hoffenheim imploded, sacked their head coach. And Heidenheim, if they were any other club, probably would have sacked their head coach as well. But obviously they've got, legendary Frank Schmidt there, and should really have never been there in the first place. Obviously they deserve to be there for what they did, but they're not the eighth best team in Germany by any means. So I think it was just a bit of a one-off where we had this freak result where, of the 8 teams that qualified for Europe last season, at least half of them imploded. But having said that, we've talked about this in the season, we talked about this in the show before in the sense that the way that European football is now played, and my kind of long-standing theory is that UEFA are curating this Champions League competition to represent the Super League, but also in a way that pulls the gravitational pull of it means that clubs have less and less financial incentive and sporting ability to apply to the domestic leagues because they're putting so much into the Champions League.
Mm.
And every single club that's been in Europe this season have been exhausted. Bayern look exhausted, Leverkusen exhausted, Dortmund, Leipzig. All these clubs look exhausted from the stress of being in Europe. And, that might just be what happens going forward, where teams who aren't in Europe, i.e., Mainz and Freiburg, who are doing very well this season, Augsburg, maybe, if they can sneak in somewhere or another. If these teams all get into Europe next season, they might get absolutely shattered by
Mm.
playing in Europe next season. And then we might be in a similar situation. So, it's either a one-off or it's a sign of things to come. So I'm really kind of covering all bases there.
I think it's an interesting point there that you make because this is also a week in which Karl-Heinz Rummenigge and Bayern Munich have, and other members of Bundesliga clubs have really gone to stress to UEFA that there should be more restrictions to the salary cap, right? And I think the reason for that is that Bundesliga clubs on average spend about 53 to 56% of their revenue on salary, whereas in other leagues that number is above 70%. And we've touched on this in the past, and I think the German clubs have come to the realization that there's 2 paths forward. One is to spend more money on players, on salary, and risk financial distress, which is something that German clubs and Germans in general hate to do. I mean, this is a big debate on the current political landscape as well, where, the government is now spending billions of euros to, or trillions of euros even on things like the military or public transport, etc. Right, and it's a huge debate and it's a huge fear factor. German angst is all about debt, right? And I think this also plays into the culture of what's going on with Bundesliga teams. They hate redundancies in some ways, right? But to be successful in a European competition, you need redundancies. You need you need a backup striker to Kane, for example, right? You need a guy who's maybe just as good as Kane to be successful in Europe because Kane can't play 85 games a year. It's just not possible, right? So you need a backup to Jamal Musiala. And Jamal Musiala makes 150 million euros over 4 years or whatever it is. So, but the same is true for Stuttgart. That means that you need 4 good center backs rather than just 2. And I think the reason why German clubs this week have been pressing UEFA to reduce the salary cap to basically get everyone in line with what Bundesliga teams are spending is to ensure that maybe they don't have to spend more. When the reality is probably because the Germans are the only ways thinking like this in Europe, and we have this every time there's a financial crisis. We have the Germans saying, no, we cannot take out more debt, right? And the rest of Europe is like, whatever, let's just spend our way through it. It's a huge cultural debate that you have going beyond the sport. And I think it's telling that this debate is there this week, Stefan, because I think at the end of the day, the rest of Europe will just spend their way out of this, right? Premier League teams are going to always spend above 70%. What is it? Tottenham is above 100% of their revenue is spent on player salaries.
No, not Tottenham. Aston Villa.
Aston Villa. There's a good example, right? Push PSG all the way. So I would love for UEFA to rein in spending on the behest of German teams, but I don't think that's realistic. So I think going forward, I think some of these German teams will just have to come with the reality and say, like, well, maybe we need bigger squads, and maybe we need to, in Bayern's case, spend some of that money that's in the Festgeldkonto and in the savings account, right, and have a deeper squad if we want to have runs. And on top of that, maybe play also in a Club World Cup.
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely like a really interesting kind of cultural difference between English and German football. It's not just about the money involved. There's definitely a different outlook, and it comes down to the countries themselves. You're absolutely right. The UK is far more in line with the US with this kind of neoliberal free market capitalism sort of thing, where I'd say most people in the UK view debt as an instrument that can be used and manipulated for their own gains, where obviously in Germany, and this goes all the way back to like pre-First World War or after the First World War, obviously, and what happened after that goes all the way back to that, and it has ramifications to this day as to why, when I first moved to Germany, I never understood why there's such a cash-heavy society until I looked into it and realized it goes all the way back to that kind of fear of debt and this idea that you can't rely on credit when money in your pocket is much more reliable. So there's ingrained psychological things between the two countries there, which are just very, very different. But that goes to the clubs that the people that run those clubs. British clubs are now, particularly Premier League clubs, increasingly are now owned and run by Americans. And to them, you have to spend a bit of money to make a bit of money, and they don't have any qualms about kind of racking up debts on their sporting franchises, as they call them, because they assume that they'll be able to get some sort of return on it. That really was the main impetus behind the Super League move. It was, obviously Real Madrid and Barcelona and Juventus were the kind of key players or the front men for it, because those three clubs were the most vocal ones that were against the kind of Premier League's financial dominance. But the real kind of psychological reason behind it was American owners in America, and in England, wanting to build a closed loop system like they have in American sports, like the NBA, like NFL and stuff, where even if you finish last in the NFL or whatever the equivalent is, you don't get relegated and then suddenly, lose 40 or 50% of your revenue stream the following season, which you do obviously in English football. So there's that kind of weird aspect to the two different ones. I kind of swing between the two as to which one makes more sense. To be honest with you, I mean, I 100% don't think clubs should be racking up debts and and jeopardizing their future to spend money. But I also do think that a lot of German clubs are maybe a little too safe with these things.
Hmm.
I also kind of think, and this is like a really prickly topic, and I don't really have much to back it up, so it's really just a hot take. But I also do think a lot of the big clubs in Germany are just too comfortable not being competitive in the league itself. There's too many like of the big kind of clubs that if you go to them and say, why aren't you challenging Bayern? They'll
Yeah.
just say, because that's the way it's always been. And I just don't think you get that attitude in England. Like in England, Brentford, if you spoke to someone at Brentford, they'd say, we want to be the best club in England. If you speak to someone at Brighton, they'll say, we want to be better than Manchester United, which I know is not hard right now, but, Chelsea 30 years ago were just a kind of top eight mid-table club. Tottenham were a top eight club. So because of the money that's came into English football, these clubs have all kind of been able to dream of being bigger and better and being world beaters, whereas there's a they just you don't really get that kind of attitude in a lot well, just about any German club, really, to be honest with you, which is frustrating. But that then comes up with its positives as well, in the sense that, German clubs are obviously very well run. And most of them, well, all of them, except for a few exceptions, are owned by the members and things like that. So I still think that's a better method. And I think also long term, and I mean really long term, like 100 years from now, there'll be a lot more German clubs around than there are English clubs, because they didn't go and agree to some tycoon buying them up. And Manu, your newsletter in 1860 is
Yep.
very pertinent to this, actually, in the sense that if you never let someone invest in your football club, yes, you might not have the money to win like titles, but you'll also never probably go bankrupt and end up losing your stadium or lose the club itself, which is
Hmm.
happening in English football every single year. If you look below the championship in England, the financial struggles there are terrifying, because there's so many clubs there who did get bought over once upon a time, did spend 4 or 5 years in the Premier League, get relegated
Hmm.
again, and suddenly they just don't have the money to kind of keep going. So there's maybe a middle ground there. I don't know what it is, but yeah, you do. Maybe UEFA has to be a bit more stronger with their financial guardrails to make sure these clubs, if they do get bought over, don't get run into the ground.
I think a club like Aston Villa spending above 100% on their revenue on salary is mind-boggling. But I also think that like a club like Bayern Munich, maybe if they spend 60% or 65% of their revenue on player salaries,
Hmm.
isn't the end of the world either. So,
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I do think too, and I actually, in fairness, Frankfurt is one of those clubs that is taking those risks, right? Which is why they have increasingly become better every single year. And I think their eventual exit too, and I think you spot on. I spoke to Timo Hardung about this, the director of football. They really want to qualify for the Champions League through the top four, in which they're on par for. They're playing Augsburg this weekend, right? It's a big game for them. And I think if they win that, they're very much on course, because they're 5 points clear at the moment. So, that is a mathematically better chance of winning, getting into the Champions League next year and making the next step as a club than, oh, now we're in the semifinal of the Europa League, but maybe some fan will throw like a piece of paper onto the field. The ball skips out for a corner. From that corner, we get scored on, and we're out of the Europa League. And therefore, because we finished fifth in the Bundesliga, we're no longer playing Champions League next year, right? I think reaching the Champions League through the Bundesliga at the moment is just way more in control for them. And that was different in 2022 when they won the Europa League. That was the
Mm.
only avenue to get in. They
Yeah.
had to throw the Hail Mary to win the Europa League to get in.
Yeah.
So it's
Which ironically is what Tottenham are having to do this season.
yeah, exactly. So I get it. It's fair enough, and I don't think we can pin we can pin a crisis on German football by what happened over this week, because also there is a scenario, a couple goals more in each of these games, and then we're talking about three teams in the semifinals, and then we're here like, oh, amazing, German football is once again strong, blah blah blah. I don't know. I think my conclusion is it's a blip, Stefan.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And Frankfurt is such an interesting example on this. And actually, the funny
Yeah.
thing about it is that I wrote a newsletter last year on the changes to the Champions League and the money that will now be involved in it all. And I think Frankfurt are probably a good example of the incentive for these clubs now to get into that top four. Because for a club like Frankfurt to get into the Champions League next season, it's life-changing money. And
Hmm.
my newsletter at the time basically theorized that we're going to have this kind of new hierarchy of like top 8 clubs maybe in German football that routinely get into the Champions League, or every 1 or 2 seasons get into the Champions League. Your Stuttgarts, your Frankfurts, and now because that money is so much more than the clubs outside of Europe will make. I mean, how much did we say Dortmund will make from the Champions League this year? It's like something like 50 or 60 million euros.
Hmm.
Stuttgart have probably made enough money now to afford not to sell one of their key players this summer. For
Yeah.
example, they've probably made more money than they would from selling 2 or 3 players this summer. So it's monumental money, and Frankfurt clearly realised that if they want to establish themselves as a top four club, they have to routinely be picking up that money. Because if they're falling behind and they're playing Europa
Hmm.
League, where Stuttgart or
Yeah.
Leipzig are winning, are getting that Champions League check every summer, every season, then they're severely falling behind. So yeah, it's just
Yeah.
interesting how football's always in flux, it's always changing, but these kind of changes to the Champions League are having ramifications on the domestic leagues, and we're seeing it perfectly clear in the Bundesliga this season.
And I mean, Frankfurt is one of those teams that actually make very good money in the Europa League because of the size of the stadium and the merchandise sales and everything. They're actually one of the top earners. Quoting Swiss Rumble here, great Substack, by the way. And Stuttgart, I think, because I think they will win the DFB Pokal, so they will be in the Europa League next year. They will get a massive paycheck from it too, because big stadium, 65,000 fans every single game, right? They are in a situation where they can actually say, oh, we play Champions League this year. Next year, we're playing Europa League. We're getting 20 to 30 million euros from that. Plus what we earn from the stadium. That was probably enough to get us back into the top four the following year. So, I think your thesis about the new top 8 is not a bad one, Stefan.